St. Martinville, Louisiana, May 3rd, 1946. Louisiana doesn't execute condemned prisoners at the state penitentiary. It sends the electric chair and a portable generator to the parish where the prisoner was convicted. This day is on the top floor of the St. Martin Parish Jail to execute Willie Francis, who was convicted of killing the chief of police's brother. Willie is the youngest of 15 children. His father is a farmhand who earns $9 a week. Willie has never been in trouble before this. Willie climbs the stairs to the execution room, followed by the sheriff. He knew he'd be scared, so he spent the last week walking down the hall of the jail. He didn't want to embarrass his family by having his legs fail him on his last walk. No one has told him what to do, so he walks to the electric chair and begins to sit down. They're not quite ready, so the sheriff brings him to a holding cell across the hall. Minutes later, the sheriff tells Willie, it's time. Willie walks to the chair alone and sits down. This time, no one stops him. He's strapped in, and his parish priest gives him a last blessing. The sheriff asks if he has any last words. Willie opens his mouth, but he's so scared that the words won't come out. He finally just shakes his head to say no. A black hood is placed over Willie's eyes. The gauges on the generator show that it's built up to a maximum of 2,500 volts. The executioner, in a sarcastic voice, says, "Goodbye, Willie." As the current surges, Willie's thin 150-pound body bucks so hard against the restraining straps that the 300-pound electric chair jumps off the floor and turns a quarter of the way around. The electricity is finally turned off, but something is wrong. Very, very wrong. All the witnesses can see that Willie is still breathing. The executioner bellows, "We'll give him another one." The electricity flows again, and Willie bucks hard against the straps again. The witnesses say they could see Willie's face puff up when the electricity hit him. After the current has run longer than it did the first time, Willie screams, "Take it off, take it off, I can't breathe." The executioner yells back, "You're not supposed to breathe." Willie screams, "I am not dying." Finally, the electricity is turned off. When the sheriff removes the hood, he finds Willie's terrified eyes staring at him. The coroner examines Willie quickly, but there's not a mark on him. Everyone is stunned. No one can believe what they're seeing. As the sheriff escorts Willie back to the holding cell, the executioner says, "I'll get you the next time if I have to use a rock." The sheriff asks Willie if he wants anything, but Willie says no thank you. He'd just like to rest. Willie was only 16 years old.
And what in essence do we have? And then with Willie Francis, to be 16, to be in the hands of these men, all white men, any pictures you see of executions in those days when they had the portable electric chair, it's all white men standing around carrying out the execution of this young black man. He was totally powerless in their hands. And so what recourse did he have? They thought of him as disposable human waste. And that's the way they treated him. And so when they strapped him in the chair, they probably had to put the straps very, very tight because his wrists were so slender. Probably his feet didn't even touch the floor of the chair, the bottom of the chair. And they thought nothing of this because in their minds they've already turned a switch. And it's what makes the execution of human beings possible. They turned the switch. He's not a human being the way we are.
No one knows what to do. This has never happened anywhere in the United States. The sheriff calls Governor Jimmy Davis.
"Please don't take my sunshine away." Yes, sir, folks, I want to tell you something and tell you for sure. You know, there's not much that old sunshine won't cure. So when you're down and you're feeling kind of low, just walk right out in its golden glow. Try not to worry and don't ever whine. Yes, my good friends, all you got to do is just take a little bit, just a spoonful. But good old-timey sunshine. One more time to the legislative choir. You are my sunshine, my only sunshine. You make me happy.
Governor Jimmy Davis, a former country singer who is famous for his song, You Are My Sunshine. The governor doesn't know what to do, so he calls the state attorney general. They decide that Willie should be executed again. Although the situation is unique and confusing, one thing is clear to the politicians. They should wait a week before trying again. They feel it would seem cruel to try a third time on the same day.
Willie was put in the chair. And I'll tell you, we all was out there praying, and the Lord answered our prayer. And I'll tell you that his daddy left from the courthouse, and he made it back, and everybody was wondering what had happened. And he was hollering that Willie made it. They didn't kill him. Everybody my age would always remember that.
In 1944, St. Martinville is a small town on the Bayou Teche with about 2,000 white French Catholics and 1,500 African Americans, most of whom are also Catholic. Its best-known landmark is a statue of Evangeline, the heroine of Longfellow's epic poem, which was donated by Dolores Del Rio, who comes to town to play the title role in the 1928 film.
St. Martinville is in deep South Louisiana, the Cajun French part of Louisiana. Louisiana is different from other southern states in a lot of ways, but probably the biggest difference is that unlike the other southern states, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants are in the minority in Louisiana because we're really like three states. You have New Orleans way over there on the east, and that's a big Irish, Sicilian, Italian, Jewish, urban setting, and that's different from the rest of the state, which is really rural. You have North Louisiana, which is your typical southern white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and then you have a third of the population down in South Louisiana where St. Martinville is, and that's all French Catholic. If you had gone into a barbershop or a grocery store in St. Martinville in the 1940s, the predominant language you would have heard was French. There was nobody who didn't speak French. There were people who didn't speak English, but everybody spoke French. Even today in 2005, if you go to the Saturday afternoon Mass at St. Martin de Tours Catholic Church, the priest does the sermon first in English and then in French.
Andrew Thomas is a popular 50-year-old bachelor who owns a local drugstore. One of his brothers is chief of police and another is chief administrator of the parish government. One morning, he's found dead outside of his home with 5 bullets in him. The community is shocked. The local paper declares that Andrew had no enemies. The coroner holds an inquest, but only 2 witnesses have any helpful information. Mrs. Van Brocklin, a neighbor, testifies that she heard several shots around midnight, jumped out of bed and saw a car with its headlights on in front of Andrew's house. Her husband says the shots were so close together that he thought it was probably an automatic weapon being fired at a temporary World War II Army camp across the street. Strangely, although the same article in the local paper says that, according to police officers, there was a terrible struggle, there's no testimony of any struggle. No law enforcement officers were called to testify, and this claim never comes up again. Sheriff E.L. Westweber is in charge of the investigation. He has no formal law enforcement training, but that was not unusual for sheriffs anywhere in 1944. For 9 months, the investigation finds almost nothing except the murder weapon found near Andrew's home. The sheriff identifies the pistol as belonging to one of his deputies, but says it was stolen out of the deputy's car a month or so before the murder. Later, the sheriff testifies that the gun was shipped to the FBI lab in Washington, along with one of the bullets recovered from Andrew's body, but says the gun and the bullet were lost in the mail. Nine months after the murder, a strange chain of events leads to the arrest of 16-year-old Willie Francis. He has a terrible stutter, which embarrassed him so much that he dropped out of school and worked part-time making deliveries for local merchants, including Andrew Thomas. Willie has never been considered a suspect in the case.
Well, Willie's an interesting kid. What I found most interesting was that nobody really said a harsh thing about him in all the interviews that I came across. There were stories that he used to hang out in the neighborhood with an old blind man, and he used to keep this man company constantly, and at the end of their time together, the old man would kiss Willie on the forehead and Willie would go home. And also he played with a lot of younger children. He was known for making little clothespin toys for these poor children in the neighborhood. And the third thing I thought was interesting is that even given the chance to go out and play with a lot of children his age, he would rather stay home and do a lot of housework and help his mom with the chores. His mother was bedridden at the time. His father was considerably older when he had Willie, and she never had to ask him to do those things. He would always volunteer, and he liked spending time with his parents. Maybe it was something that he was the youngest boy. He felt like that was time that he could spend with his parents.
Nine months after the murder, Willie is in Port Arthur, Texas, visiting an older sister. The police are waiting at the train station to arrest a drug courier. They chase a suspect who runs away carrying a suitcase, and the suspect escapes, throwing the suitcase away. Willie is sitting nearby watching the trains pass, and the suitcase lands near him. The police can't catch the suspect, so they arrest Willie. What happened next was described by the district attorney in a hearing held after the unsuccessful execution. The DA said that the Port Arthur police chief had been in St. Martinville 2 weeks earlier, and Sheriff Ressweber had told him about the Andrew Thomas murder. The sheriff told the police chief that if he ever caught anyone from St. Martinville in Port Arthur, he should arrest him because the sheriff, in the DA's words, had been unable to arrest the right man. The DA said after only being questioned for 2 or 3 minutes, Willie volunteered that he had killed Andrew Thomas. Less than a week later, Willie is arraigned in court in St. Martinville and pleads not guilty. He has no attorney, so 2 prominent attorneys from nearby towns are appointed to represent him. Without consulting with Willie, they immediately moved to change Willie's plea from not guilty to guilty, but the judge doesn't allow it. It was the last motion the attorneys ever made in the entire case. The judge sets the case for trial in a week, and the lawyers don't object. They don't request a change of venue despite the fact that the local paper has just run a headline declaring Willie to be the murderer. The trial begins 6 days later. Willie's appointed lawyers make no opening statement, don't ask a single question of any witness, and never make an objection. When the prosecution rests after introducing Willie's confession, the defense rests without calling a single witness. They don't call Miss Van Brocklin to testify about the car in front of Andrew's home with the lights on when they heard the shots. That evidence is significant because no one in Willie's home owns a car, and Willie can't drive.
I know that Willie was not guilty of that. Willie was not guilty of that murder. There was never no evidence that Willie did that. Never. Never. There was a gun that was found at the murder scene. It wasn't Willie's gun. Willie never owned a gun. You know. It was later identified it was somebody else's gun, but it was stolen. Now, where Willie gonna steal a gun? Willie couldn't fire a gun. You know, the shot that was fired, no way in the world. Even the neighbors testified that there was 2 white males that ran from that scene. And one of them came back to try to pick up the gun. But he panicked, and then they left off.
24 hours after the trial starts, the jury returns a verdict of guilty. Under Louisiana law at the time, a death sentence is automatic. Willie's lawyers filed no appeal.
And also the whole issue that only poor people are selected for the death penalty. It is so blatant at this point. When you look at, we've executed almost 1,000 people since we put the death penalty back in '76. Virtually all of them are poor. And what that means structurally about why we can't get to the truth at trial is getting to truth at trial is based on an adversarial system. Defense presents, prosecution presents. And if you're poor and you have defense attorneys appointed to you who do nothing, the bad thing for the whole system, including the jurors, is you can't get the truth. Jurors do their best with what they get, but it's distorted. Some things are hidden, and they don't know the truth. So then they're asked to play God and go behind closed doors and decide if a fellow human being lives or dies. It is inevitable that wrong decisions will be made because you don't have that adversarial way of coming to truth, because poor people do not get good defense. Truth on their side can't be told. Prosecution prevails. People are sentenced to death.
The Louis Peters case, the Louis Pete case, is the case that points out how tragic it was that Willie's lawyers didn't make any attempt at all to defend him, because you had an all-white jury that acquitted a black man of murdering a white man. His lawyers presented a defense, he had a defense, and an all-white jury acquitted him. St. Martinville was not a place where a black defendant was automatically guilty. And that's not a guess. I mean, that happened, and it happened before the Willie Francis trial.
Then after the unsuccessful execution a month later, Willie waits in jail for a new death warrant to be signed. Willie's lawyers may have been content to do nothing, but his 70-year-old father was not. He goes to a young attorney named Bertrand DeBlanc. He was a friend of Andrew, and his wife once worked for him. He's the grandson of a former justice of the Louisiana Supreme Court who founded a local Klan-like organization known as the Knights of the White Camellia. DeBlanc explains that he just returned from the war and he's broke. He has a wife and 3 young kids and is struggling to start a new law practice. He can't afford to work for free. Willie's father sits quietly and cries. DeBlanc knows there's nothing in this case for him. A loss hurts his reputation and a win alienates the white community. And in the South in 1946, they are 99% of his potential clients. But in front of DeBlanc is a poor man pleading for help to save his child's life. He tells Willie's father that he'll take the case. Willie's father brings DeBlanc 2 gallons of potatoes, the only fee he ever receives. The next execution is scheduled in 3 days. DeBlanc ran to the Louisiana Supreme Court and got a 30-day delay. DeBlanc is realistic. If he was going to get any relief, it wouldn't be in Louisiana. He hoped that the extremely unusual facts would move the U.S. Supreme Court to hear the case. But DeBlock has no money to travel to Washington, has never handled a murder case, and never appealed a case to the Supreme Court. To overcome these disadvantages, he enlists the help of a young Louisiana attorney working in Washington named J. Skelly Wright. There's no automatic appeal to the Supreme Court. It will only take an appeal if 4 of the 9 justices vote to allow the appeal, and it takes less than 10% of the cases that apply. But DeBlock and Wright felt they had a good chance because there was a widely held belief that the state was only allowed one bite at the apple when it came to the executions, and a failed execution, which had never happened with an electric chair, was seen as a divine sign that the prisoner was innocent. And the reaction to the failed execution had been enormous. Virtually every major U.S. newspaper carried the story, along with many around the world. The response was unanimous, from newspaper editorials to Walter Winchell to Father Flanagan of Boys Town. There were thousands of requests to spare Willie's life. A California woman sent a telegram offering to let her disabled husband take Willie's place in the electric chair. Another woman wrote to tell Willie that she felt terrible about his situation, but if he was going to be executed, would he please leave his eyes to her blind brother? Willie was touched by the request and asked DeBlanc to prepare a will for him so he could leave his eyes to the blind man. But Willie's aging mother found out, and it upset her so much that Willie had to write and apologize. He had to cancel the bequest because he couldn't stand to upset his mother. On May 10, 1946, the Supreme Court voted on whether to hear Willie's appeal. The clerk of the Supreme Court called Wright and told him that the request to hear the appeal was denied. Wright called DeBlanc with the bad news. Both were shocked. DeBlanc blamed himself for getting Willie's hopes up and went to the jail to tell Willie. In a scene repeated often, Willie tried to console DeBlanc. He told DeBlanc that he never thought the court would save him and thanked DeBlanc for all of his hard work. Some reporters came to the jail to get Willie's reaction, and DeBlanc didn't want them to bother Willie. But Willie said it was all right and told the reporters that he would continue to pray. In another strange twist in this case, the next day, a panicked Supreme Court clerk called Louisiana Governor Jimmy Davis. The clerk's office had made a huge mistake. The court had agreed to hear the appeal. When DeBlanc got the news, he raced to the jail to tell Willie. For the third time, the teenager had to prepare to go back to the electric chair, only to get a reprieve. Now DeBlanc and Wright had to decide on which legal arguments to emphasize in this brief. DeBlanc and Wright argued that Willie's lawyers had done nothing at trial and that Willie had not truly had any representation. They also argued double jeopardy. To try to execute Willie again would be punishing him twice for the same crime. Their strongest position, however, was the Eighth Amendment, which prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. The court had previously ruled that the Eighth Amendment only applied in federal court trials, not in state trials. Despite this, Willie's lawyers felt that they had two very strong points in Willie's favor. Willie's case was extremely unusual, and it certainly seemed cruel to put a teenager through something so gruesome as an execution twice.
Well, you know, the title of my book is Dead Man Walking, and I got that from Albert Camus, who wrote in France in 1957, called Reflections on the Guillotine. And his point was that by the time a person is brought to their death, they have died inside mentally. They have been through the death 1,000 times in their nightmares, in their imagination, in their dreams. And so inside, they begin to die. I'm sure inside, young Willie must have thought, I don't have a chance. I don't have a chance. It's going to kill me. Then he has to try to deal with death. He has to try to deal inside his young mind with what they're doing to him and how it's going to hurt his mom and his daddy, what it's going to put his mama through. That's the essence of torture, of the death penalty. It's mental torture. People count the hours, they count the last days, they count their last time they speak with their mother and their family. All of that is part of the torture.
On November 8, 1946, Willie's case came up for argument in the Supreme Court of the United States. Because he was more experienced, J. Skelly Wright handled the arguments. After the arguments were finished, there was no way to tell which way the justices would vote, or even which way they were leaning.
Once the oral argument has finished, the justices disappear behind their velvet curtains, and little is known about the process, which is one thing that's fascinating about the Willie Francis case is through the papers of the justices, we're able to recreate, in large part, what occurred. And what occurred firmly supports what one writer once said was that the decision-making process results in, quote, desperately negotiated documents. And that's what the Willie Francis opinion is, a desperately negotiated document.
The court had a precise and traditional method of deciding cases. All 9 justices would meet in the Supreme Court conference room at noon on Saturday to decide the cases which had been argued that week. The only people in the room were the 9 justices, no secretaries, no law clerks, no tape recorders. We only know what happened because of private handwritten notes of the justices released many years later. The Chief Justice always leads the discussion and casts the first vote. After discussing Willie's case, Chief Justice Vinson voted to allow another execution. He then went around the table to record the votes of the other justices. Sitting around that table were 3 of the Supreme Court giants of the 20th century. Hugo Black from Alabama, a former KKK member who transformed into the leader of the liberal wing of his court. William O. Douglas, perhaps the greatest defender of individual civil rights to sit on the Supreme Court in the 20th century. And Felix Frankfurter, a former Harvard Law School professor, a founding member of the ACLU, and considered by most, including himself, to be the best legal mind on the court in 1946. Surprisingly, Black voted to allow another execution. So did Douglas, so did Frankfurter. The vote was 6-3 in favor of allowing the state of Louisiana to put Willie Francis in the electric chair again. The Chief Justice assigned Justice Stanley Reed to write the opinion. 3 weeks later, Reed sent the first draft of his opinion to the other 8 justices. Reed's opinion said the unsuccessful execution was an unfortunate accident, but an innocent accident, and since there was no suggestion that it was the state's fault, the Constitution did not prevent a second execution. Justices Frank Murphy, Harold Burden, and Riley Rutledge were the only 3 no votes. Burden, a Republican from Ohio, said that another execution would be the equivalent of burning at the stake. Murphy, a graduate of the University of Michigan Law School, believed that sometimes you had to ignore the strict rules in the search for justice. He once wrote, "I don't care what the technicalities are, I just won't do it." The 3 joined together to write a powerful dissenting opinion in hopes of changing other votes. It worked. Douglas read the dissenting opinion and then changed his mind. He was voting to reverse. Now it was 5-4. If the dissenters could only get one more vote, Willie could not be executed. Then Justice Robert Jackson decided he could not go along with the majority opinion either. Although he would not vote to reverse, he would write a separate opinion saying that Reed's reasoning was wrong. Next, Hugo Black defected and decided to write his own opinion. Frankfurter also made it quite clear that he could not go along with the majority opinion either. The Chief Justice was staring at a disaster. The court's sensitivity to public criticism was perhaps at its highest level in its history, because of the widespread criticism when it ruled that significant portions of FDR's New Deal were unconstitutional. What would be the public outcry if only 2 of the 9 justices could agree on why another execution was legal?
So in a case sending an individual back to the electric chair, you only had 2 justices agreeing with themselves for the rationale of the court. You had 3 separate concurring opinions, and you had 4 justices explaining why the poor individual should not go back to the electric chair. So Reed was stuck. You had 2 people joining him, 3 sort of agreeing with the result but going elsewhere, and 4 strongly opposing him. So he had to scramble.
All 9 Supreme Court justices began their careers as lawyers. But Supreme Court seats aren't always given to the 9 best lawyers or judges in the U.S. These are the most prized and prestigious judicial positions in the world. It's rare for a Supreme Court justice to be without some political skills. And in controversial, emotionally charged cases like this, the horse trading between the justices can be intense. Reed went to work to try to win back 3 votes to support his opinion. He first went to Jackson, who he had worked with in the Attorney General's office, and finally convinced Jackson to sign on to the majority opinion. He next approached Black, but the man from Alabama was hard to move. In 1946, Black firmly believed that the 8th Amendment should apply not only to federal courts, but in state courts too. Reed rewrote his opinion 4 times to try to accommodate Black's position. When Reed finally agreed to the strongest language yet in support of the argument that the 5th and 8th Amendments should apply in state courts, Black agreed to vote for Reed's opinion. It was now 4 in favor and 4 against. The deciding vote was in the hands of Felix Frankfurter.
Justice Frankfurter really made the Supreme Court his life's work. He was nominated to the court from a law professorship at Harvard Law School. The study of the Supreme Court was really truly his life's work. So when he was appointed to the court, perhaps no justice has ever been more prepared for his work on the Supreme Court. And he really did view the Supreme Court, much as he said in a famous saying, that he watched over it much as a mother would watch over a feverish child.
On June 13, 1947, the opinion was announced. Quote, "So far as we are aware, this case is without precedent in any court. Our minds rebel against permitting the same sovereignty to punish and accuse twice for the same offense. The traditional humanity of modern Anglo-American law forbids the infliction of unnecessary pain in the execution of the death sentence," unquote. And that language came from the 4 justices who voted to allow another execution. The 4 dissenting justices were outraged at the prospect of another execution. They said, quote, "shocked the most fundamental instincts of man," unquote, and that it was the modern equivalent of burning at the stake. Justice Burton said it was the state's responsibility to get it right, and any second chance would be cruel and unusual. It was all up to Frankfurter. He said he did not personally approve of capital punishment. He said he personally would commute Willie's sentence to life in prison. However, Frankfurter said that he must put his personal feelings aside because, in his opinion, since it was an, quote, "innocent accident," unquote, the Constitution did not prevent another execution. Willie got the bad news on his 18th birthday. After casting the deciding vote to allow another execution, Frankfurter then did something which had only happened once in Supreme Court history. He personally went to work behind the scene to try to save Willie's life. Among his classmates at Harvard Law School was a New Orleans lawyer named Monty Lehman. Frankfurter immediately wrote Lehman a letter marked strictly confidential. He told Lehman that Willie's case weighed heavily on his conscience, and he asked Lehman to use all his influence to get Willie's sentence commuted to life in prison.
One of the most extraordinary stories related to the Willie Francis case is Justice Frankfurter's extrajudicial machinations. The Willie Francis decision came out in early January of 1947. Justice Frankfurter sends a letter dated February 3rd, 1947, to a Harvard Law School classmate by the name of Monty Lehman, who is a very prominent lawyer in the state of Louisiana, a very prominent member of the Louisiana Bar, entreating him to act on behalf of Willie Francis and send a letter on behalf of Willie Francis to the State Pardon Board. In all my years as a lawyer, I've never heard of a situation where a judge, much less a justice of the United States Supreme Court, effectively goes behind the backs of his colleagues to effectively overturn a court decision. And making the actions of Justice Frankfurter even more extraordinary is the fact that he could have provided the fifth vote for Willie Francis not to go back to the electric chair for a second time.
Lehman started immediately. James Simon, the judge who presided at Willie's trial, had been a student in a course Lehman taught at Tulane Law School. Under Louisiana law, Willie's death sentence could only be changed to life in prison on the recommendation of the Pardon Board, and Simon had one of the 3 votes on the board. Lehman wrote to Simon and pleaded with him to commute Willie's sentence and sent a copy of the letter to Frankfurter. Frankfurter gave copies to all 9 men on the Supreme Court, which certainly indicates that the entire court continued to follow Willie's fate. The Pardon Board agreed to give Willie a rehearing. Just before the hearing, Louis Cyr, a good friend of DeBlanc's, stopped by to commiserate with him about Willie.
Later, though, in April of 47, Bertrand DeBlanc was working in his law office, and a local city official stopped by his office and asked Bertrand DeBlanc what he was working on. And Bertrand DeBlanc said, well, I'm working on the Willie Francis case. And the local official said, yeah, that's really a shame what happened there. And Bertrand said, yes, it was. It really is a tragedy. It looks like he's going to go back a second time. And the local official said, well, yeah, that's bad. But what I'm talking about is it's horrible what happened the first time, which was, the fact that the 2 electrocutioners were drunk. Bertrand DeBlanc says, what? He goes, yeah, somebody told me that they attended the electrocution, and both the guard and the inmate were drunk, and Bertrand DeBlanc was stunned.
Turns out what happened was Captain Effie Foster, who's a guard up at Angola, and a trustee, Vincent Venetia, who has been an inmate his whole life, these 2 gentlemen were given the task to go out to St. Martinville and set up the chair and execute Willie. Now, normally this was never done. The warden would go along with a chief electrocutioner, and there would be a professional, I guess you'd call him executioner. His name was Grady Jarrett. He traveled all around the state, and he was known for being very friendly with the prisoners, very professional, and nothing ever went wrong. Well, none of these people were there. So here you have the inmate and the trustee out on their own. They're away from Angola. They decide, we don't have to do anything to do until the morning. Let's go hit the bars of New Iberia. So they went past places like the Jungle Club, the Tesh Club. They finally ended up in a place called the Green Lantern, which was right off West Main Street. And it was owned by a man named George Etty, who later signed the affidavit saying, I saw these guys. They were drinking. They were inviting some of my patrons over to the execution in the morning. They were talking loud and laughing. They stayed all night. And later on, early that morning, they had to be up at 8 in the morning to perform this execution. And another townsperson in St. Martinville, Ignace Doucette, He says he saw them passing a flask back and forth between each other. It was so hot, and they would go back and sneak behind the truck and drink and then go back upstairs and hook up the chair. And he said, you know, they kept getting the chair wrong. They'd have to start all over again. They were swearing. And, you know, eventually Skelly Wright said these two men were so drunk he doesn't know how they could have done anything.
DeBlanc gets an affidavit from Sear and an affidavit from an eyewitness to the drinking and presents the evidence to the pardon board. Despite this, Judge Simon and the board voted unanimously to allow the execution in 2 weeks. Time was running out. Even though his total fee had only been 2 gallons of potatoes, DeBlanc borrowed money from his sister and flew to Washington to file a petition for habeas corpus with the U.S. Supreme Court. All of the Supreme Court justices had assumed the first execution went wrong because of some innocent accident. Surely they would stop the execution with this new evidence. The Supreme Court refused to stop it, but purely on procedural grounds. The court said it was limited by the Constitution to hearing appeals and could not grant habeas corpus, but it took the extraordinary step of telling DeBlanc and Wright that a federal district court in Louisiana certainly could grant such a petition.
But then it was interesting. Chief Justice Vincent went on to say, given the grave allegations that are made here, this case is dismissed without prejudice for refiling with the proper tribunals, which was a very strong hint by the Supreme Court that this is very serious. Refile with the state courts or the federal district court and get this case back up to us. It's very, very unusual for the Supreme Court to make this sort of comment about, given the grave allegations at issue here. It really truly was virtually an invitation that this matter continue onward.
DeBlanc raced back to Louisiana. On the plane, he wrote the necessary paperwork to file with the district court. On the morning of the scheduled execution, he visited Willie on the way to the federal courthouse to tell him what happened in Washington and that he was on his way to federal court to stop the execution. Willie told DeBlanc not to do it. He told DeBlanc that they were going to kill him no matter what, and he couldn't put his parents through more hopeless delays. In a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life, DeBlanc agreed to let it drop. Before the next execution, Willie once again practiced walking up and down the hall in the jail. "I have to die like a man," Willie said. He was the only person alive who knew what a horror he was facing, but he did not want the fear to cause his legs to go out, because that would embarrass his family.
See that last bit of dignity for legs to hold him up, like young Willie, you know, asking for permission to just walk so that his legs would be under him when he goes to take this walk. Sometimes I put myself in the position of these young people, or anyone really, to be executed. I don't know that my legs would hold me up if I would be told, for whatever reasons. All the legalities disappear. Everything disappears. This is a moment of your death. You're a human being. And I would be wondering if my legs could hold me up, knowing that if I were to walk across this room, knowing when I go through this door, I've left my family, everything I know on this earth, and that I'm going to be killed. And to walk to your death knowingly, and then to allow yourself then to be killed, I can't even imagine what that is.
Willie's favorite food in the world was fried chicken, but his family was so poor that he only had it for Christmas dinner. Willie ordered fried chicken for his last meal, but as he was served, he realized it was Friday. As a Catholic, Willie would not eat meat on Friday. DeBlanc offered to get the cook to fry catfish for Willie, but Willie said no. He didn't want to put the cook through any extra trouble. On May 9, 1948, Willie Francis should have been in his last month of high school. Instead, he was being strapped in an electric chair for the second time in his young life. He saw Sidney Dupois, a kind, gentle local barber, who the sheriff had asked to be one of the official witnesses. Willie asked Dupois about his 6-year-old son, little Sid. Willie said, "You take care of that boy, you hear?" Dupois answered, "I will, Willie, I will." Judge James Simon of St. Martinville was elected to the Louisiana Supreme Court in 1960. He resigned 9 months later as part of a plea bargain to avoid criminal prosecution for federal income tax evasion. J. Skelly Wright became a federal district court judge in New Orleans in 1962. He later became a judge of the United States Court of Appeals in Washington, D.C.
Years later, Skelly Wright became a famous judge with the Courts of Appeals in New Orleans and the District of Columbia. And he said the ultimate test of a justice's work must be goodness. And if that's the test, then surely the Supreme Court in the Willie Francis case failed it.
Bertrand DeBlanc was elected district attorney in Lafayette Parish, Louisiana in 1960. But after Willie's case, his heart wasn't in prosecuting. He wanted to defend poor people. For the final 10 years of his legal career, he became the only attorney in Louisiana history to go from being district attorney to being the head of the Indigent Defender's Office.
And I know the American people don't know this. They think we got the best court system in the world. They don't know how this thing works. So what better than to bring them close to it? So telling this story of Willie Francis brings people into this whole issue. It's like Willie walks again among us. In a way, he is a dead man walking because he's going to become alive again to us, his story. And there's going to be a part of us that wants to say, oh, but that was back then. We're much better now. We're not any better now. In fact, I think we're worse. He had some very special kind of inner strength in him, young Willie Francis did. And, I can't help it. I mean, my instinct is to want to pray to him and to just say, really help us to work for justice, to carry on, what your life was about so that your death is not in vain.